Hey, this is Troy Taylor with the Championship Football Coaches Clinic podcast, sponsored by Reps, Virtual Reality, First Down Playbook, Rack Coach, Tip of the Spear, the Top Hopper, and Sports Workbook. Today, I was just walking down to my classroom, thinking about how blessed I am to have the GOAT of recruiting. You know, sometimes guys are very humble and they get upset when you put them on a pedestal, but I'm going to put it out there and say it. I mean, it all started with you, Tom Lemming, and I got my great friend, Blanda Wolf, Mr. Virginia. He should be governor. I mean, he might as well run for it. He could win. So, you know, Tom, for the people that don't know who you are, which most people do, tell us a little bit about where you're from and how did you get into high school football recruiting?
Well, I guess I'm from America because I'm never in Chicago where I live. I'm always traveling around. I've been gone maybe 3 of the last 4 months, traveling nationally. But I got involved. Actually, I traveled. I never went to college. I was supposed to go to Western Illinois where my brother went. And my brother now is the head of the state police in Illinois. He's a police chief now at Western Illinois University. Instead, I took the money I was saving up a couple of months in 1977. I was in the pyramids in Egypt in 78. I think I got my education traveling around the world, but then I realized, I don't have a plan. What am I going to do? My sister was working at a place called the Southtown Economist in advertising, and she got me to a job where I would do $5 a night covering football games. And I noticed the people weren't that interested in who was winning, St. Rita or Mount Carmel. They wanted to know where the top players were going to school. And there was no national thing back in the 70s. There was Parade Magazine, but most of the guys were local. If you're in Virginia, everybody knew Virginia Tech, maybe a little bit of Maryland or North Carolina. But for the most part, you didn't know where the kids from Texas or California were going because it wasn't really concerning you. So I decided to do something different, which was travel around the country and meet them all. And I would just travel back. My first trip was October of 78. And the only memorable guy, 2 of them, one was Jerry Faust at Mulder High School, wound up being the head coach of Notre Dame. And the other one was Dan Marino, a high school senior to be in Pittsburgh. And he met me over at Pitt Stadium back in October of 78 before a game.
Man.
So that was my first travel. And I've been traveling ever since. And I've been able to go back and forth to the moon 4 times with my football travels.
Man. See, I asked Blanda, were you a mailman? And he went and looked it up, and you got the nickname mailman because you deliver the information. You deliver the mail. And I knew Dan Marino was one of your first guys, but how did you get the nickname the mailman?
I actually did work for the post office for a while. When I started my magazine in 78. First 6 to 7 years, I lost money, and I had to get a job. First, I worked at a printing company as a printer. And then the post office offered a job where if I got my job done early, I could do my work and everything else and travel. And so I did work at the post office for 5 years until I started making money. And actually, I remember Glenn Mason. Some of the guys making fun of it, calling me the mailman. It was actually meant as a slur at the time. But then later they go, well, Sports Illustrated did a story on me in 86, and they called me, he delivers the mail, meaning football-wise. So then it turned from a slur to a positive, so I didn't mind it.
So I'm going to say one more thing. I'm going to let Blanda ask a question. Maybe, Blanda, you could talk about how you first met Tom and ask him something. But, Mr. Lemming, like, there's people – man, I'm going to cry, man. Like, there's people in the world that they change it, and they're trendsetters, and they're game changers, and they move the needle. And what you did – I mean, I don't know if it was divine intervention, but you saw the future. I mean, Steve Jobs, you saw the future. You knew what people wanted, and you gave it to them. And now it is blown up. I mean, it's almost became an animal, that's not controllable. I don't know, but like, I just want to give you your flowers and tell you that. So, Blanda, when did you first meet Tom Lemming? And man, I'm blessed to have you on here.
First, Troy, I appreciate you having us. I've known Tom quite a while. Probably, I don't know. It may have been back in the Verona days when we had a couple guys that were coming through, like Mike Robinson or Brandon Miner, one of those guys.
Jamal Branch. Andre Branch.
Andre Branch. Andre was a little bit later developing, but it was probably one of those guys. I can't remember exactly, but each year after that, we've gotten together, and he's helped us, quite a bit with different things, over the years. Tons of knowledge. It's just great to have someone like that you can reach out to and find out some information.
Have you got anything that you want to ask him, Blanda?
Well, I know with Blanda, for me, I've always been connected to University of Virginia. Blanda has been the one constant through all the coaching changes and either turmoil or the good things that happen. He's been the one constant for University of Virginia that you could always count on. He's always been honest and sincere. Even if Virginia's not getting that player, he's always been really good about, talking about the good ball players and not because I remember Bob Pittard at Georgia was a recruiting coordinator back in the 80s. And I remember him telling me, he goes, here at Georgia, Tom, we never lost a player. Either the other team cheated or we didn't want him in the first place. And that's kind of the way a lot of the guys are. So when you do, and everything with me is a collective opinion. It's not just mine, because I've cards. Matter of fact, one of the guys I just was talking to, Al Golden's now at Notre Dame. I met him at Virginia. Here's a quick story there. Back in 2001, Al Groh left the Jets, and he called me up and he said, how come you've never done a front cover picture with Virginia kids? I didn't know how he knew it. I think he was just guessing that I never did. And he goes, you got to do it over here. And I did it. And I fly into Richmond at the time. He had writers from Charlottesville and Richmond meet me at the airport. And I knew there was going to be some trouble because other coaches don't like that. And then we came in, he goes, I'm going to take you on a tour. Our GA is going to drive around looking for location shots for the picture. Like it was a big Hollywood production. Usually I get my camera bag and that's it. I just take pictures. Anyway, he has a bus take the kids from the football office to the rotunda.
I think y'all took that picture on the lawn, I believe.
The lawn.
Yeah, we did it with the big round building with the pillars.
Rotunda.
Right, yeah, the rotunda. There. Yeah, we did in front of there, and actually the picture, Athlon magazine used the picture. Everyone did. It turned out to be great. We got every top player in Virginia. However, Frank Beamer and Phil Fulmer, two guys who later became my co-host on TV, turned it in. And there's an NCAA rule, a Tom Lemming rule, like if after 2001, that if I do the pictures on campus, the kids cannot see the college coaches. They've got to leave campus and then come back, which is kind of ridiculous because the next year I did it for Frank Beamer and he did it at their German club, which is in the middle of the campus, but privately owned. So we had the kids meet there and they just walked across the street. And Phil Fulmer did it at that little World's Fair globe he has. And we walked down the hill to the Tennessee. So there's always ways around rules. And those two guys were two that always knew the rules and ways around them.
I just watched the movie Air, and I was kind of like blown away by Sonny Vaccaro. And like, I don't know if he found the talent or it came to him, but I mean, I don't know if you're kind of like him, Tom. I mean, you've just been so blessed. I mean, talk about finding Dan Marino. What was that like?
Well, he was a big name, so he was easy to find. There's a lot of guys that aren't that easy, but nowadays it's tougher and tougher because of social media. Even the bad kids are getting a lot of publicity. Blanda knows all about that because you gotta actually sift through hundreds of bad kids to find that one gem nowadays. Back then, in the 70s, there was no social media. There were payphones. Kids don't even know that you'd go into a phone booth and make a call. And I didn't even have a credit card. I had to pay cash for my gas. Sometimes I slept in my car the first 2 years because I didn't have enough money every day for hotels. So every other day I would sleep in the car at little rest stops among the trucks, so I'd be safe. And it was an adventure. When you're in your early 20s, it's an adventure. Nowadays, I wouldn't be able to do that. But back then, it was a lot of fun. And I knew Sonny Vaccaro. I met him over at Princeton at a basketball camp. And he sure was a talker. And he was a guy that got things done. He was a big, I think, one of the real big guys for the All-American, like McDonald's All-American team and a lot of those, because they came up before we started doing throughout the 90s. I was with ESPN in the late 80s and 90s, and we would do an All-American team. And then I helped start the U.S. Army All-America game back in January. We actually had one game in Dallas. It was a disaster in 2000. So the next year, 2001, we played it outdoors, which was somewhat of a disaster. But then NBC got the 2-year contract, and we were able to talk kids first I was able to get Chris Leak to announce. And then after that, the whole dam burst and 18 to 22 guys would announce, and there wouldn't be nobody cared about the game. It was all about the announcements after that. But it was a lot of fun. We're doing the new Army game this coming December 18th. We're going to play, the Army's back in business, and we're going to play it at the Cowboys facilities in Frisco on December 18th.
Wow. So were you the guy that invented the press conference, I'm taking my talents to Miami, all the different hats on the table, or were they doing that before you, Tom?
Well, I think I kind of started it with Ron Paulus in 1991 with ESPN. It was myself, Mike Gottfried, and Dan Debbingham who left because he was a big name. People don't remember him now, but Chris Fowler took his spot. Chris was his backup back then. And we had Ron Paulus, the #1 player in the country, announced live. I think he was the first guy to do a national live telecast. But then we waited another 10 years before the Army started doing it. Again, social media wasn't around really in the 90s enough to where they would have guys announce. So once we started doing it with the Army game, it started picking them. Now the kids all announce on Twitter. So there really isn't, even during the games when kids announce, they've already signed. It's just a matter of trying to keep it quiet until they can make their announcement and give them a little airtime. So I did that, and I also started the star system, which I'm embarrassed to say right now because in the 80s I used to give stars on the magazines. But back then in the 80s, it was 2 stars. Then Mike Gottfried was my partner on ESPN, and Mike said had a charity thing for his daughter who's mentally challenged, and there were 7 years in a row we did it in Mobile, Alabama. It'd be Tim Brando, Paul Feinbaum, myself, Kenny Stabler, and Mike, and Gil Brandt. And Gil's the most famous scout of all time. So I always sat next to him and picked his brain. I said, "What do you do in the NFL?"
Who's the most famous scout of all time?
Gil Brandt for the Cowboys, for the Dallas Cowboys. So Gil was telling me that with the Cowboys, they use 8 stars. And so I said, hey, well, the next year in my magazine, I use 8 stars, confused everyone. So then I went to, and back around 92, Peyton Manning's for a year to 5 stars based on hotels. That's it. Movies would do 4-star review, but hotels had 5 stars. And that's how simple it was. And nowadays, I think most of the kids get their stars based on how many offers they have.
Yes, sir. So Peyton Manning, was he the first 5-star?
Yeah, well, he was among them that first year, 92 or something what that was.
Yes, sir.
I think every year I always give between 45 and 55 stars. There's no set number, but I don't want to set it. I know some of the internets do it for the NFL with 32 teams, but I'll try to do 45. So I'll give a few more. But Peyton Manning was that first year when I did 5 stars back in 92.
Yeah, Blanda, you got anything?
Yeah. Tom, who's the best player you think you've ever seen at the high school level?
You know, Blanda, I said that because I used to write for USA Today, and back in 92, there was a sophomore in West Virginia, and I was sitting in the Pitt football office watching film. Actually, my son was like 4 years old, and I saw that kid. They go, you think the kids here in Western PA are good? Go look at this kid in West Virginia. And I drove down to it with my son to the high school. Right. It was still before cell phones. So I had to call the coach, and it was Randy Moss as a sophomore at Bell and DuPont, which is a suburb of Charleston. And so I saw Randy, and he was a surly kind of a non-communicative kid, except for me because I put him in the next day with Dave Kreider in USA Today as the best player I'd seen in the country, and he's only a sophomore. So that gave him national publicity. He went from being a local star as a sophomore to a big national star, because if somebody's saying you're the best player in the country and you're only a sophomore. So for the next couple of years, I'd come down to visit Randy, and he would talk to me. He let me know ahead of time that he was signing with Notre Dame, even though he didn't announce for until signing day. So let me know a couple of months, because I think he felt obligated with me. And I still think he's the best player I've ever seen. Blanda, I'm sure you saw film on him. He was hurdling players. He had the quarterback, Jason Williams, who wound up playing basketball as a point guard. Yes. However, and Jason couldn't throw that far. He'd be throwing the ball out in the flat, and Randy would catch it and start hurdling defenders like he was running the low hurdles. And amazing. But he was All-State 3 straight years for basketball, track, and football. Still the best high school football player I've seen in 45 years.
Wow. I was fortunate. When I was in my first year, I went to Concord in West Virginia. I was fortunate, Stu Brown, and I went and watched him play basketball and football 2 different occasions while we were up there. So, yeah, he was special. You're right.
I mean, as a scout, do you always have a point of reference when you see a player? I mean, I guess you don't when you see Randy Moss, because I don't know if there's ever been anyone else like him. But how do you do it? Like when
You know, you're right.
Does he remind me of somebody?
It's a good question, because I used to do that on my TV show. And for me, being around 45 years, I saw a lot of people. Quarterback-wise, wasn't Marino or wasn't Peyton Manning. It was actually Jeff George, if you remember him from Indiana. Yeah. He had the best arm. And Billy Callahan and I are good friends. We played at the same time in the Chicago area high school. And then when Billy got to the Raiders, him and John Gruden would let me use their facilities. And I always talked to Billy. Billy then became head coach of the Raiders and had Jeff George there. Jeff Bone, I don't know, he wound up and maybe played for all 32 teams, because a bit of a head case, I think. But his arm strength was phenomenal. And John Gruden, Billy, all of them told me that no one had better arm strength. They just, if he had been a little bit more team oriented, he could have been a Hall of Famer. But his arms, I was picking the USA Today team since its inception in 1982. And in 1985, he was my offensive player of the year for the country. And running back wise, the beginning of my career, Eric Dickerson, I went to see him in Sealy, Texas that first year. Phenomenal. Then the next year, Herschel Walker came out. Then the year after that came Bo Jackson. And the year after that was, what's his name from Mississippi, Marcus Dupree. Every year it looked like there was going to be a 6'3", 230-pounder running a 4.3. But after that, I think there was almost like a 20-year absence till Adrian Peterson for another big, super fast running back. But back then, that was the year of the running back. And I think Blanda could attest to the fact that nowadays you're looking more for receivers or slot backs or guys that can run and catch. Not as many people looking. Now those big guys that can run are usually playing defensive end or linebacker.
Yeah. I mean, it's just amazing to me. I mean, you had LeBron James rated as the top player in the country, didn't you? I mean,
well, no, he was on my All-American team. He wasn't the top player, but I went to see LeBron at in Akron, St. Vincent, St. Mary. And the basketball coach had called me and said, you got to come and see him. But he wanted me to see his son too, Cian Cotton, who was the center on the basketball team. I think he averaged 1 point a game with LeBron. And he played, and he actually was going to eventually wind up at Ohio State as a defensive tackle. So I go and I'm sitting in the locker room, and I don't really follow basketball, particularly high school players. So I didn't really know who LeBron was, except all-state wide receiver. Had a lot of catches as a junior. So then LeBron comes in and we're talking, and he's kind of a quiet guy. He's not talking at all at that time. And finally I said, well, you're 6'8" and you're telling me you got a 43-inch vertical. I says, you'd be out of your mind not to play football. No corner could cover you. Then he says to me, well, I just got offered $7 million to play my high school senior in Italy in a pro league. And then I said, okay, well, maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree here. I didn't realize who I was dealing with. And believe me, I knew nothing about him basketball-wise until I got to that school. But I got in my car, and a buddy of mine does a 50,000-watt radio show in Cleveland, Jeff Sindelar. His show, so I turn on his show, and the whole show is talking about the number one pick in next year's NBA draft will be LeBron, the guy I just saw. And that's how I started knowing more about him as a basketball player. And he was phenomenal. He could have been an NBA. He could have been a number one draft choice in the NFL. I mean, again, he ran a 4.7, but he was 6'8", 230. So, I mean, he had great tight end size. He had great hands and great stats and a very tough league there in Akron.
I mean, just you talking about Jeff George and how he was the best quarterback that you've seen. Like, I went back and looked at the 2008 top 10, and there was only two guys that I knew. I think Andrew Luck was 8, and then Julio Jones was 2. But thinking about it, it wasn't that maybe it was wrong, but at that time, were those guys, did they peak out too soon that were in the top 10 that 8 of them we never heard of? Or, I mean, how do you look at it, Tom, as far as best player at that time?
Yeah, at that time. Plus, nobody's perfect, and you get guys that maybe have reached their peak, or because of injuries or bad grades or off the field problems, which a lot of them have. They never reached their peak. One of the guys is real close to Blanda, Chris Slade. He was my National Player of the Year, along with his teammates at Tabb High School in Virginia, Terry Kirby. And they both wound up being great players, but they were top 10 guys. And they did everything right. They went to Virginia, which is a good academic school also. They were coached well. They trained hard. But there's so many guys that I've seen. I could give you some big name guys There's one kid in Chicago who's in jail now for murder who was one of the great ones I've ever seen. He was a 2-time heavyweight wrestling champion. He was a 3-time All-Stater in football, defensive end. But his grades were atrocious, didn't really go to class. And back then, you had to go to class. Nowadays, everyone graduates. So there's something going. Blanda probably could have. Virginia is a good academic school. They probably bang their heads on the wall and say, how'd that guy get into that school? But now you don't see anybody really flunking out or not making it academically with the test score or the GPA.
Blanda, what's on your heart? What are you thinking?
I was just thinking, Tom and I over the years have talked quite a bit. Let him talk a little bit more about some of the, coaches back in the day. They would come by his house and watch film and things like that. And he's got some good stories.
Yeah, Blanda, I was with Mac Brown a little while ago, and Mac was telling me, I brought my camera crew to film with him a couple months ago, and he was telling me that he came to my house in 1979 to watch film as an assistant at Iowa State. I used to open my doors up and obviously never charge anything. But back then, that's when VHS tapes started coming in, because when I first started, a lot of them were still using 16 millimeter. But I would take boxes of VHS tapes, now that they're back in 79, 80, 81. And throughout the 80s and 90s, coaches would come to my house to watch film. And that's how I got my connections. Mac probably was there with 10 other coaches. I didn't remember him coming to the house. I do remember him as head coach in North Carolina, because he brought Tim Brewster, future head coach of Minnesota, who's now with Dion over at Colorado, to my house his very first day on the job as a GA, because back then GAs could travel. And Mac Brown introduced to me and said he wanted him to recruit Chicago. So they'd sit and watch film. But guys, Sean Payton's first day on the job as a coach came to my house at San Diego University to watch film. And Sean was in my 1980 magazine as a quarterback. He's from the Chicago area. And Marv Lewis and Lovie Smith. And I mean, you go on, John Gruden, all these guys who would come by the house, Billy Callahan, Brad Childress. A lot of the guys now in the NFL that are head coaches would come to my house to watch film. And that's how I get my connection. Like Sean Payton gave me the Saints facilities every year. So I'd get everybody in Louisiana. They wanted to come down, not to see me, but to see Sean and some of the players working out in Metairie, their facilities there. And then Sean would talk to him. John, I had lunch with John Gruden last year, and John was telling me that you remember that Tom Brady came over to our get together in Alameda, where the Raiders, and he was head coach. John was head coach, and Billy was offensive coordinator. And I do remember inviting Tom, because when Tom was in the last Super Bowl 2 years ago, he said that they said, you weren't very good in high school. He goes, no, I was a Football Report All-American. I had him on the All-American team. He threw for 3,000 yards. But when he showed up, he was tall, but he was not non-athletic looking, and he was very slow. And his arm strength was okay, but not great. Not like Jeff George or Dan Marino. So it's surprising now that he's the greatest of all time. But that shows you what hard work and opportunity could do, because Drew Henson should have been the quarterback his last year there, but Drew left after taking $10 million from George Steinbrenner to play for the Yankees. And he didn't play his last year at Michigan. And that gave Tom Brady a chance to play. And he did well, but he still wound up, I think, the last pick of the 6th round. So if he had not played that year, he'd probably be a car salesman in Northern California now.
Yeah, Blanda, what you thinking? Because, I mean, I'm just blown away, having Tom here and all these different coaches that he knows. I mean, Tom, how does it feel with social media and YouTube? I mean, look at me. I'm a high school coach in Richmond, Virginia. I've been doing these podcasts since January, and I got Tom Lemming on here. I mean, but aren't you the same way? I mean, you were a mailman and boom, you blew up. But what would you have done today if all this internet and, I mean, would there have been a niche for you?
I would have probably gotten involved with sports, because when I did get back from Egypt, which was 1978, that summer, I tried to work with the Chicago Cubs, and I put my name in and everything else. But since I started doing the football, I said, okay, I'll do my own, because I'm more of a baseball fan than a football fan.
Wow.
And I decided to go the football route, but I wanted to stay in sports. And I was young, 22 years old. I probably would have found some niche, because I did have connections with different schools. At least friends of mine were playing big-time college ball that had played with me. And for me, there wasn't much room for a 5'10", 155-pound safety back in those days. Although I did run a 4.5 Blanda, and I ran 11. Back then, it was a 10 flat 100-yard dash, and I mean, which would be now like an 11 flat 100-meter thing. But and my nephew, who played at Bowling Green, ran a 4.4. So I think we could run. We just weren't big enough, most of us. But I did have fun. And, one other story is going to tell you. I remember when Sean Payton got to the Cowboys as offense coordinator of Parcells, and Gary Gibbs was there from Oklahoma, who I had known as when he was head coach at Oklahoma. They let me use the Cowboys facilities, the old ones. Back then, we used to have a lady hanging the clothesline out by, and the coaches were real upset and had to put a big fence up. But anyway, I had the top 30 players meet there. So Sean Payton and Gary Gibbs are showing them around, and Parcells says, bring them into the weight room and I'll talk to them. So we all come in, and the kid, the number one lineman in Texas, and may have been the number one lineman in the country, real cocky kid, 6'5", about 330, 340, but he was good. He comes in and he puts his feet up on the weights while he's talking with his head behind his, 2 hands behind his head. And he's just, real bragging. And that. Parcells comes in with Quincy Carter, one of my former All-Americans, who's quarterback there. And Parcells blows up. Get your feet off my weights. Where's your mother at? Where's your mother? And you go, here, coach. Did you let him put his feet up on the furniture at home? She goes, no, coach, I don't. He doesn't listen to me, coach. You don't listen to your mother. He starts screaming and yelling at him. And he goes, and one other thing, he goes, you're too fat to play for the Cowboys. You're too fat. We don't have guys like you. Quincy, who's allowed to be fat in my weight room? And he goes, only you, coach. So
Wow.
I thought that was one of the great lines. And that kid went from being a real arrogant, cocky kid, and boy, Parcells brought him down in just 30 seconds. I loved that story. And it was true. I'm standing right there, and I'm getting a big kick out of it because this kid thought he was everything just as a high school player and done anything in college. And you know what? He wound up going to college, not doing a whole lot, because I don't think he wound up in the NFL, even though we had him rated as a 5-star.
Coach Bald, who's from St. Petersburg, Florida, wants to know what one school had the most guys go D1 and then NFL. We had 5 at one time at Lakewood: Wynn, Fowler, Valdez, Scantlin, and the Griffin twins.
Well, it's a lot different now because of the Catholic schools. Modern day usually has 20 go Power 5 a year.
Yeah.
And so does Bosco out in California, because they recruit. If you remember, the quarterback at Modern Day left as a junior in high school to go play for USC, and he started as a freshman. So, and not getting mad, all Bruce Rollinson did at Modern Day was he go take the quarterback from Cathedral and bring him over to play for him, and that quarterback winds up going to Alabama and winning a Heisman, Bryce Young. So they just replenish that, because those powerhouse school, that Trinity League, everyone wants to play in it. So all the other schools, the kids that develop, it's sort of like IMG. I'm not a big fan of IMG because they steal everyone's players and they don't really develop them. In my mind, they're already developed. They get down there, but they brag as if we did this with this game. No, almost every kid that plays for them already was an all-state player, a big star at their local school around the country. IMG just takes credit for it. And so I had written that about a year ago, and I think they got a little upset when they read it.
Wow, the truth hurts. Blanda, you think of anything? I was going to ask you about the high school coaches, Tom. What high school coaches stick out in your mind over all these years? I mean, who were some of the characters? What are some of the stories?
Some of the Blanda, what's the coach at Somerville that was like 90 years old, still coaching? He had AJ, the wide receiver in the pros, but he had him in Somerville, South Carolina. This guy coached for 70 years.
Yeah.
I mean, It was unbelievable. I'd go see him, and he was one of those old school guys. Back when I started, they were all old school. No one wanted to help in recruiting. They're all a pain in the butt. I can remember in '82, the first year of USA Today, I was going around the country and picking the team, and I went to see Mark Stepnowski up at Erie Cathedral Prep. It was a dungeon-like office. The coach had a 16 millimeter, and he puts it on, and he's rolling it. And Stepnowski looked better than anybody I'd seen in the country. So I said, Mark, I'm going to put you on the first USA Today team, because that paper was super big back in those days when it first started. And he got real excited, and he goes, oh, my God, all my work has done me favors. He goes, I went to work with Joe Moore last year, and he goes, and I worked a week with him in this, and I'm thinking, wasn't at a camp, so you better stop talking. And back then, of course, it's 1982. There are no cell phones or anything. I had to wait till I got home, and Coach Fozzie was the head coach, and he goes, hey, whatever that kid told you in Erie was no good. He goes, he's talking off his head. There's nothing going on. We didn't do anything with that kid. And I go, Coach, I'm not going to say anything anyway. I said, well, it's not my job, my business to because back then everybody just at least 70% of the schools are doing a little bit of stuff like that. And Foge goes, hey, Tom, when are you coming to a Pitt game? Changed the whole subject when I said I wasn't doing anything. But
yeah, that was Coach McKissick.
Coach McKissick. That's right, Blendy. Yeah. I go see him.
About him the other day. Where Coach Elway was talking about another day where a couple of things came up and he was talking about him. So yeah,
70 years. It's phenomenal. Oh, there was guys like Bruce. Right now, Bruce Rollinson is sort of the kingpin out at Modern Day. He's won several national titles. And he's got most of his quarterbacks go to USC, but his one quarterback went to Alabama. A lot of them go everywhere, and he's got great players, great linemen, linebackers. Every year, because I do the Butkus Award for high school, every year he's got a linebacker that's in the nomination group, at least one linebacker. Jerry Faust was a great high school coach. Back when I started, he was the kingpin nationally because he started the national travel. Back then, no high schools would travel nationally, but Moeller did. They'd go play Penn Hills in Pittsburgh, which to them was national, though Cincinnati to Pittsburgh's like, a 4-hour drive. But he would go there, and then I think they played out in California. And then other high schools started. Brother Rice in Birmingham, Michigan, Alfred Casa, who he coached right up until the last decade. And he was already a seasoned coach when I saw him back in 78. So a lot of the big-name guys there. And George Smith down at Aquinas High School in Fort Lauderdale, who later became their AD, was a great coach. Another surly guy who I got along with, but he was those old school that college coaches were afraid of him. They go in there, and he would, if they upset his schedule, he'd be yelling at him, and didn't matter who the coach was. He didn't care because he's got the All-Americans like the Bosa twins or the Bosa brothers and Michael Irvin. He's had so many great players at school. He'd care less about who's coming to visit him. So he was one of those old guys that I loved it. And I love the old school guys, and I'm sure Blanda does. Well, Blanda's an old school guy, even though he's young.
Yeah. Well, the guy I worked for, Coach Chilco, was old school. So he implemented a lot of things, that, it's changed a lot these days. A lot of things that, a lot of stuff, and then, Mike Smith is another great one, at Hampton High School.
Oh, yeah.
I think he's third all time, in wins. So, that was a good one to have in our state. And he did
Blanda, when he had Ronald Curry, who we put as our USA Today Player of the Year, but also Michael Vick had come from the Tidewater area, and I brought them both together. I brought like 4 or 5 guys there together at his high school in Hampton. And I remember Mike Smith telling me, he's a great athlete. He'll never make it at quarterback, about Michael Vick. Because he was a grumpy coach, Mike Smith, and he was a guy that difficult to kind of work with. You knew him better than I did, so I'd go see him once a year, and he was always kind of a pain in the ass, to be honest with you. He was just kind of a grumpy guy. But I do remember him praising Ronald Curry as the best quarterback this country's ever seen and everything, and that Michael Vick was a great athlete, but it would never make it at quarterback. That's what he told me.
That was 2 pretty good ones that lived about 5-10 minutes from each other.
Oh, what a great area it still is. Tidewater is one of the better areas nationally, and that's why Virginia Tech used to just really live off of it until Blanda got to Virginia and changed that.
Well, I remember, the deal with Vic. He was never first team all district ever because he was had Ronald Carey in his district, and and Ronald Carey was committed to Virginia originally.
Yeah, I can see that's probably why Mike Smith probably felt that way too. Since he never made All-State or anything, but he did run a 4.2, and it means a lot. Yeah. Especially Virginia Tech. Only 2 schools that ever promoted him to me was Virginia Tech and Syracuse. And they both wanted him to be the quarterback that he turned out to be. The other schools weren't looking for quarterbacks like Michael Vick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he changed the game, definitely. He did.
Yeah,
we'll give Coach Kavanaugh a lot of credit on that one. Coach Kavanaugh was a great,
absolutely,
great in those days.
So, how about the college coaches? You mentioned a few already, but over the years, who are the college coaches that stick out? Stories, characters that you've had to deal with and that you've met? I mean, golly, I want your Rolodex. Blanda's Rolodex is like Tom Lemming's. There's only one person in America.
Well, the best, when I started in the late 70s, I thought Barry Switzer and John Robinson were the 2 best recruited. Is because I'm not involved with the coaching part, but the recruiting part. Barry Switzer did whatever it took to get a player. 2 stories on Barry Switzer. first, Barry telling me I had only had a few run-ins with him, but he was always a character. And I remember him telling me about Tom Osborne. He goes, the only difference between Tom Osborne and me is that he has a better publicist, because Barry was getting all the negative stuff. And what he was implying was that Osborne was just as bad as he was, but
I need
had
to
a great
talk to him. I need to
PR
talk
guy.
to him. I feel like him.
Well, here's another story. There's a running back in 1980 named Alvin Ross, 79 or 80. He was my top player in the Chicago area, or one of my top 2 or 3. Great running back from Aurora, Illinois, suburb of Chicago. So it came down to, I think, Illinois, Michigan, Oklahoma. There was another school, maybe even Penn State, for Alvin Ross. And back in those days, Blanda would know that head coaches were allowed to be at your house at 8 a.m. to sign you. And the great players, they had to be there or they're not going to get them. So Alvin Ross, 8 a.m., these guys are waiting on the porch. And Mike White told me this story. It's Mike White, I think Bo Schembechler, can't remember who else, but they're waiting there at 8 a.m. in the cars. About 10 minutes before 8, they come up. They're all waiting on the porch. 8 o'clock, the door opens up. Out walks Barry Switzer. And he goes, hey, guys, I got it. No need to stay here anymore. I've got the scholarship here signed and the letter of intent. And he just walks out. He had talked the mother into letting him sleep on the couch overnight. And he stayed there at 8 a.m., got the signature and left there. The other guys didn't know about it, and they stayed there. They got there real early. And Mike White told me that story. And it was, I've heard a million of those stories back in those days. A lot of them are cheating stories, so I won't repeat them, but there was a lot of hanky-panky going on back in. And, I was not involved, but I was doing it back in the old Texas days with SMU and Texas A&M and Eric Dickerson. And when I did Eli Manning's show last year, we were talking, and the guest the week before me was Eric Dickerson, and they were driving in a Trans Am, which obviously became famous with Eric getting a Trans Am on signing day, or a couple of days before signing day, because Sporting News took a picture of him by his Trans Am. And everyone thought SMU gave it to him because he signed with SMU. But the implication was, because he never came out and said it, was the A&M people gave him the money for the car, and then he signed with SMU. He outsmarted all these oil people down in Texas, which I thought was a great thing for an 18-year-old kid to do. And Eric wound up being a Hall of Famer, so it wound up really good. But those kind of stories, and Craig James was part of that. I went to see him at Stratford High School in Houston in '78. As a matter of fact, I went from Stratford over to Sealy, which is maybe about 45 minutes drive between the two, and they both wound up as the Pony Express. And that was a great year, and SMU started getting all the great players. Mark Gann from Colorado, they were getting a lot of them. And the stories are being thrown out left and right by the players, how much they were getting. So it was just a matter of time before the NCAA would come after them, and then eventually, because they got caught twice in 5 years, get the death penalty.
Man.
And on the average, how many miles you think you drive per year to see different prospects all over the country?
I did average it out, Blanda, last year. I think I do 60,000 miles in 6 months, because I'm usually on the road for a 6-month period. Not all 6 months, but a good part of each one. Like when I do the thing in Charlottesville, I'll drive out there and then try to hit kids along the way in Ohio and all that, and have the kids. I think it's Monticello High School. Have them meet, and I'll do the same thing. Like this year, I got one at Penn. I got one every. I've known James Franklin since he was a GA at Maryland, so I do one every year for him. And I'll have all the kids in Pennsylvania meet me at State College High School. Then they just go off to the game. I got one. Mike Leach and I were very, very close, and I filmed with Mike at all 3 schools he was at. Texas Tech, we filmed with him in 2007. Then at Washington State around 2017, and then last year I filmed with him just about a couple months before he passed away down in Starkville. And Mike and I both have a lot of this same interest, which is the mob in Chicago and JFK conspiracy and just history. And I had taken pictures of me in front of where John Dillinger was shot in Chicago at the Biograph Theater, and only a half mile from there is where the St. Valentine's Day Massacre had happened. Mike was trying to get a kid in Chicago to recruit so he could justify coming up and spending a day. Him and I and my brother, who, since he's a cop and a high-ranking cop, could let us park in different places. But we're going to go to Al Capone's home. And Mike and I had talked about it just about 2 weeks before he passed away. He was coming up this past January to do a Chicago mob history tour with me. And wonderful guy, though. Such a good guy. He was unassuming. He was a big-name coach with no ego. He didn't have that kind of ego that most of the other coaches. I've seen coaches, I've talked to them, that don't want people looking them in the eye that work with them. You know, they've gotten the movie star kind of attitude. When I'm on campus, don't you talk to me at all. You know, and yet I've seen coaches get that big and that high mighty.
Wow.
And most of them eventually wind up coming down like Joe Paterno, who I never liked. So I always thought Joe was a bit of a phony in my mind.
My dad hated Joe Paterno too. He used to call him a crybaby. My dad, you know, we used to watch. First game I ever remember was Penn State versus the Miami Hurricanes. I guess it was the national championship. But Coach, when Mike Leach passed away, it bothered me so much. I didn't even know him, but
you would have loved him. You would have loved him. Blanda, did you know him? Blanda, did you know Mike Leach?
I was fortunate to meet him. I met him 1 year we're in Nashville at the Gaylord Hotel for the AFCA convention. He sat down and was talking to me like he knew me like he known me all my life. You know,
he was such a wonderful guy for being a big name coach. In 2007, my camera crew was coming out. I just interviewed Pete Carroll and in Los Angeles, and then I'm driving from LA to do another thing in Phoenix and then meet my camera crew in Lubbock. So that right after that, we had filmed with Jesus, Tarzan, and Davy Crockett, all three friends of mine that I had helped Tarzan's son get to Harvard. And then Jim Caviezel, who played Jesus in The Passion of the Christ, is a friend of mine, as was Fess Parker, who I got to know. And he grew up as a big fan of Fess Parker and Ron Ely, Mike Leach. So he watched that show. So we're coming in. My producer couldn't reach him. And he's calling me. So the day of filming, I'm driving in, and Mike calls back, and he's, "Oh, Tom, I'm so sorry I didn't call your producer." He goes, "But my wife and I were out in Marva, Texas, watching looking for UFO lights all night." They're just sitting in a car waiting for lights because I guess it's supposed to be showing up there. So then he takes me in the car. We have a camera guy in the back seat, another one in another car, parallel in our car. We drive 45 minutes south of Lubbock to the Dan Blocker Museum, Huss Cartwright from Bonanza TV show. We go to his museum. The two old people that were running the museum by appointment only were in heaven because the two big names in West Texas back then were Mike Leach and Bobby Knight. And they were in heaven having Mike Leach in that museum. And he was so good to them. And then we start driving back, and I get here in my IFP in my ear, my producer going, "Tom, does Coach Leach know this is a football show?" And so I go, "Don't worry, we'll handle it." So instead of going back to the football stadium, he takes us to the Buddy Holly Museum. And now my producer's going crazy. He goes, "How are we going to use this stuff?" I said, "Well, you know, it's kind of good. It's sort of like what Anthony Bourdain does. You know, he's a food show, but he really adds other stuff, politics and sports and other things and history to his show." I said, "It's nice." And then he takes us finally to the office, and, you know, all the schools got the little water treatment where the kids are working their muscle pulls. He pulls it up to the front where there's only a splash of water on the top, takes shoes and socks off, and starts walking across. He goes, "Look at me, everyone. I'm Jim Caviezel instead of Jesus." He's walking. So Leach was just a character, and I thought his show was the best. And I had done shows, Coach Saban and every big name, Sean Payton, Bill Parcells, and I thought the best show we ever did was with Mike Leach because he is such a different type guy, but a wonderful guy too.
I mean, what can high school coaches learn from Mike Leach and how he lived his life and how he coached? I mean, what do you think? I mean, genuine.
I don't think take your business home with you. I think here's a good thing. When I filmed with him also in 2021 in Starkville, he had just lost that game. They had set it up to win it with a field goal, 20-yard field goal, and his kicker missed it with no time left. So any other coach, if I'd gone to visit Coach Saban or Kirby Smart, their head would have been through the wall, and I had to interview them on the other side of the wall because they would have smashed their heads. Leach comes in and started talking about everything else. Like nothing happened, and it's less than 24 hours after that loss in the football of it on Sunday. And I think he knew. I think he might have had a heart condition that he knew about and everything, and I don't think he took anything serious. I mean, obviously he took football seriously, but I do think that he left it on the field and didn't bring it home, and that's why he was able to enjoy life so much.
We have a question from Coach Moten. He's one of my coaches, and he's from New Jersey. He said, "Did you know anything about a kid out of South Jersey named Willie Flipper Anderson who went on to play wide receiver at UCLA and the Rams?"
Sure did. I went to visit Flipper Anderson, and Bill Reese is the guy that got him from Bill Bill was actually the first traveling recruiting coordinator, a guy that really wasn't a coach. The first guy that got the big name that they made the name recruiting coordinator was Jerry Pettibone with Oklahoma back in the early 70s. And they started calling people recruiting coordinators. That's the first time I ever heard that. I was still in high school. And Bill Reese was the first traveling recruiting coordinator that he was around the country all year. There were no rules back then. He could go out. He wasn't one of the 10 coaches, but he was listed as one of the 10. So he didn't have to be on the field coaching. He was just traveling all around. And I remember at Penn State, Notre Dame, UCLA, and Bill Reese is the one that got Flipper Anderson, who was the best receiver east of the Mississippi that year.
Wow. So all these coaches that you've met, I mean, what do the great coaches all have in common? Is there anything?
I just think that I've said this before, as far as recruiting is concerned. I said this on the air with I was doing a show with Rick Neuheisel and Adam Zucker signing day, and I didn't know who our next guest was coming up, but we're doing a live show, and I said to Coach Neuheisel, show me a coach that's a prolific golfer, and I'll show you a lousy recruiter. And I was teasing him because he was a good recruiter, but he golfs all. And our next guest was Steve Spurrier, the poster boy for golfing and not recruiting. He thought I was talking about him, and he's got that high voice. And I said, no, Coach, I'm talking to Coach Neuheisel. I didn't know you were coming on. He goes right away. He goes, Ricky, we got to go play 18 at so and so someplace in Columbia. So I think you could say most great coaches are great recruiters, but Steve Spurrier wasn't. He was just a great coach. There's a few like Spurrier, but most of them are like Saban, and Kirby Smart, and all the big names. You got to combine the two. And nowadays, you have to be a great recruiter. Dabo Sweeney is a great recruiter. James Franklin is a great recruiter. Ed Ogeron was a great recruiter. And he's the opposite. I think he was a great D-line coach, but as a head coach, he won the national title by bringing in two great coordinators, guys that could actually run the football aspect of it while Ed was out there recruiting. And it was great for a while until it kind of imploded. But Coach Kelly at Notre Dame is the opposite. He's a great coach. And at Notre Dame, I don't think he was a guy. He wasn't a whirlwind at recruiting. And Marcus Freeman is a whirlwind. So I figure Notre Dame's going to be recruiting well. But you could just tell. I know most of these guys, and I could tell every year when a new coach comes in, they always recruit well their first year. They put at least effort into it. They're going 24/7 at recruiting. But eventually, the guys that have always had that lazy attitude will eventually wind up being lazy. Brent Bielema had that trouble at Arkansas. He's a good coach. He did well at Wisconsin because they recruited mainly local guys. They looked for skills someplace else. But he got to Arkansas. He had to be in the Southeast Conference where you got to recruit every single hour of the day. And I think he got overwhelmed by that. Now he's at Illinois back in the Big Ten, which is turning a bit like the SEC, but not there yet. And he's having success there doing things his way.
What you think, Blanda?
Yeah, I think the ones that are, they're outgoing. They can talk to the kids and things like that. I've been fortunate to work for several of those guys, and they're just good people. They're all about the right thing. Making the kids scholar athletes. Having them graduating, it's got to be the main reason that you're here, to help the kids down the road. I mean, we have several guys now working in our office that were players here, and it's great to see them, putting their knowledge, giving knowledge back to the guys that are, so we got a couple guys visiting right now, trying to get those guys to come here, and, down the road, those guys could be like in one of our shoes, but, we're fortunate to have those guys.
Blanda's at a school that, is known for their academics too, which is really good. So they do things the right way. There's a lot of schools that don't. A lot of schools that'll skip things and academically try to get the kids into classes that are, either easy or maybe non-existent almost, so they can spend most of their time in football. It's turning that way a lot more now than it had been in the past because there's so much pressure on these guys to win and get the great players and collect as much talent as possible. And certain schools, the more they recruit great players, probably the more I would imagine the graduation rates drop because a lot of the guys are leaving after 3 years and aren't even close to degrees.
How long have you known Nick Saban, and what is so great about him?
Probably all 45 years when he was an assistant. And that's why I'm one of the few guys that can get in there and do an interview with him. I went to interview about 4 or 5 years ago during the season, and we had to rent a CBS crew from Birmingham to come down, and they were deathly afraid of him. I guess they had run-ins with him already filming, and he's a holy terror most of the time. But with me, we sat there, and the SID is walking back and forth, afraid of him. So the SID goes, "You only got 20 minutes. Remember, only 20 minutes." We sat and talked for a half hour about The Blind Side and everything else, and then other things. And we didn't start filming for a half hour. Then we filmed for 20 minutes, and then we sat and talked for more. And the SID's in the back of the room pacing back and forth. Don't forget, this is during the fall. But I was afraid to say anything to Coach Saban. The coach goes, "Hey, let me go show you my board." So I follow him in there. And this is a true story. One of his assistants goes, and I think I don't follow him speed race or motor racing, but he goes, "Coach, this is Casey Kanan, a famous racer." I knew that name, even though I never knew what he did. And Coach goes, "Hey, good to see you." And he just keeps walking. And Casey looked like he just saw God. He's like, "Oh my God." And then he sticks his hand out to me. He has no idea who I am. He goes, "Casey Kanan." I go, "Hey, Casey, I'm telling." And I kept walking behind Coach Sim. I go, "Coach, that's a famous racer." And he goes, "Oh, that's great." And he just kept walking.
That's great. He can't help me win.
Part of that story, you're right. Part of that story is he is so focused on football and winning. He doesn't have to cheat. He doesn't have to do anything. He is a great coach, combined with the best recruiter I've seen in 45 years. There's no one better than Nick Saban. He's in his 70s now, and he's still doing it.
What makes him so great?
It's just complete focus. And, I remember I was sitting when he was head coach at LSU, and the kid, Big Baby, who I think went basketball instead of football.
Oh,
he was a basketball guy in Louisiana. We're in the office, and Nick tells a joke that really wasn't that funny, but I could see the kid didn't get it.
He told a joke.
Yeah, and I said, and Nick laughs the way he laughs, and then I'm laughing because out of politeness, and the kid didn't get it, but he just laughs because we're laughing. And I always remember that. But perseverance, personality, because when he's recruiting, he's great with the kids. Plus, he's the biggest name in college football. So when a kid sees him, they go crazy over it. And but perseverance, personality, and star power is what does it for him. He works hard, and he outworks almost every head coach I've ever seen. He is on the phone with these kids. He's got a great camp where he gets a lot of them to show up there. So I don't think anybody's approached him. Like I said before, when you asked me a question, back then it was John Robinson and Barry Switzer. When Notre Dame had 4 number 1 classes in a row, it was more Vinny Serrato than it was Lou Holtz. Lou Holtz did not like to recruit. He liked the golf. But he had Vinny Serrato. As soon as Vinny left for the 49ers after 6 or 7 years, Notre Dame talent level started going down. So it was great indication that Vinny was the one doing it, getting the great players, because he, like Bill Reese, wasn't a coach. He just traveled around the country. Then Joe Paterno got that rule changed, or was one of the guys that helped push it, because he didn't want to travel around the country. He was getting older, and he didn't like the fact that they had one of their coaches out recruiting them. So the rules changed where Rick George, who's now the athletic director of Colorado, Rob Ianello was at Wisconsin, Vinny Serrato, all either had to be coaches or moved to the NFL. So Bill Reese and Vinny moved to the NFL. Rob went to Arizona to learn how to be a tight end coach. And all the other guys either went to the NFL or went into administration if they weren't coaching. But by the time the rules were changed, which was, I think, mid-90s, almost every school had one of those guys that would just be on the road. But after that, now they had to be a full-time coach to do that.
So Coach Bald, he's bringing up a name here. And this is a guy, he replied to one of my tweets, and I was like, oh, my gosh. Jimmy Johnson, Miami Hurricanes.
Jimmy Johnson was Iowa State, I think, when I met him. With Earl Bruce was head coach right before he went to Ohio State. He had a lot of really good ones. Mac Brown was the wide receiver coach at Iowa State, and he coached Vinny Serrato, who then went on to be the great recruiting coordinator at Notre Dame and then general manager of the Washington Redskins. Wow. And Mac, that's when Mac came to my house at Iowa State. But when you look back at Earl Bruce's staff at Iowa State, it was phenomenal, and they recruited great. I remember one year they got Chris Bosky, the number 1 player in the state of Illinois, Iowa State. You never heard of that before, and they were able to get him. So it shows you how the power of recruiting can really change things around. When Hayden Fry got to Iowa, they were just an also-ran program. When Barry Alvarez got to Wisconsin, also ran program. they developed, and now they became powers, really, with Hayden Fry and with Kirk Ferentz. I was continued, and with Barry, and then Brett Bielema, and then after a while, there's been a dip off at Wisconsin. But it comes down to who the head coach. Really, it is important to get a head coach that knows how to coach and how to recruit.
How did you get hooked up with the movie The Blind Side? I know that it was a book, and I read the book, but it wasn't entirely about Michael Oher. So were you involved in the writing of that book and then being in the movie and playing yourself? Talk about that, Tom.
Yeah, I wasn't involved with the writing, but I'm in the book a lot. And the reason was I was the one that gave Michael Oher all the publicity. His high school coach, people don't remember, was Hugh Freeze. Yeah, it wasn't the guy's name in the movie. It was Hugh Freeze. But in the book, they kind of rip Hugh Freeze being a guy who wanted ride Michael's coattails to Tennessee and then Ole Miss with Ogeron. But anyway, that was my last year at ESPN, 2004. And they used to have a car with my head on it, move me along the internet whenever I was traveling. So okay, I'm going to be in St. Louis today. Tomorrow I'll be in Memphis. So Hugh Freeze knew when I was coming to Memphis in March, called him, said, Tom, I got a kid, great ball player, he's never played football before, but he sent me tape of a kid. And he said he's 6'5", 350, and he timed him in a 4.8, which is ridiculous. But he sent me a tape, and the kid was going through the rope drill like Baryshnikov. I said, Coach, if that kid's that big and that fast, I'm going to name him the #1 tackle in the country. So I get the top 10 players in Memphis meet me at the University of Memphis back then. And the guy who opened the doors for me was Clay Helton, who later became USC's head coach. So Clay was just a recruiting coordinator then, opened the door, and he said to me, Tom, we were hoping you weren't going to come here because we're the only ones that know about this kid, big athletic kid who never played football. So then I see him, and he's a surly kid, and I sit there for about an hour. The other 9 just left. He didn't fill out his questionnaire or anything. I go, Mike, I saw you on film. I see you now. You look like an NFL player, but I'm not going to put you in the Army game because I don't like your attitude. I said, but I am going to name you the #1 tackle in the country tomorrow. And I did it on ESPN.com. And we named #1, and then he blew up from that because he hadn't played football yet. And all of a sudden, Memphis knew about him. Tennessee didn't even know about him. Fulmer comes in, calls up. There's still 2 months before they're allowed to be on the road, so they get out there. And then once everyone got to the school, he just blew up. And there was no film of him except going through the rope drill and just doing drills. But they saw him in person. They knew anybody that looks like this kid's going to be a great player. Just got to be coached a little bit. Grades were horrible. He didn't even go to class until his last year at the private school. So I don't know how he got it into Ole Miss. But he's a nice kid. He was very quiet. So I put him in the Army game. 6 months later, Hugh Freeze calls me up and he goes, Tom, Michael's sitting here crying because you don't have him in the Army game. And all the other guys listed below him are in there. I go, got to be kidding. He was surly. He was monosyllabic. He acted like he didn't want to be there. Didn't fill out anything. And he goes, Tom, that's because he can read or write. That's what Hugh Freeze told me, which partly true, probably. I said, then he tells me the story of Michael Oher. I didn't know the story until then. I said, well, we need a center because every year I would just bring tackles, whoever the best player. I said, we need a center. Could you teach him how to play center in 1 month? Because now it's December 1st. And every week, Hugh Freeze is calling me. He's doing great, Tom. He's teaching him how to long snap. He plays in that Army game flawlessly at center and long snaps. He was that good of an athlete. Unlike the movie where they made him look like didn't know what he was doing and moving around. He was a great athlete. And a week in San Antonio, I still don't remember him ever talking to me. I'd go up the escalator and even like Aaron Hernandez, guys like that would, hey, Mr. Lemming, how you doing? But Michael Oher would just go up come down the escalator with bags of food. I go, Big Mike, how's it going? All that, and just had his head down and never replied or anything. He was very shy, and I don't even think he worked very well with the other players. He was just too introverted.
Blanda, what are you thinking? Anything else you want to ask Tom? We've almost had him on here for an hour. I mean, we could spend all day talking.
You know, we talked quite a bit. Like he's got a lot of different stories. I mean, a lot of different stories over the years. You know, we've gone to dinner a couple of times, and it's amazing some of the things. And
Blanda picks up the check. But I get something about Blanda. Every year I go around the country, there's people I rely on. Blanda's the man in Virginia. He knows everybody. He knows all the players. If there's any question I would ever have, Blanda would be the only guy. I don't talk to Virginia Tech really because of Blanda. Blanda knows every top player. He's honest about all his evaluations, and he's really the guy. Like I said, he's the one constant at the University of Virginia for the past several years. even with coaching changes. The one constant has always been Blanda Wolf.
Man, have you ever done a YouTube podcast like this?
No, not this long. So, but I've done them around the country. Yeah, it's nice. It's good to kind of, I enjoy them. I do like talking about, because a lot of times they say, well, who you like this year? I do like talking about a lot of the old days. I think I'm an old soul who longs for the old days of the late 70s, and I'm sleeping in my car and not taking a shower for 2 or 3 days and showing up as a 22-year-old with hair all sticking straight up. And people back then, I used to lie about my age that way because I wanted that people think I was 25 instead of 22 because I was too close to the age of the players I'm interviewing. Now I'll lie the other way. Say, no, I'm not 69. I'm only about 65 or so, but I've been doing it 45 years and actually almost 47 years. It'll be 46 and I'll be 69 this September. So it'll be 46 October of this year.
Coach asked me, does it matter the number of college bracelets, different colored college bracelets that recruits wear? Is that ever taken into consideration where a kid is ranked? What is the most amount of bracelets you've ever seen a kid wearing of different colleges?
For me, I do magazines and television. I don't do the internet like I used to do with ESPN. Thank goodness, because the internet guys got a lot of pressure on them, and how they change a guy from a 3 to a 4-star when he hasn't played or gone to camps is beyond me. It's all based on offers. They deny it because it makes them look like they're lazy. But the fact is, if a kid's a 2-star and he gets an offer from Alabama or Ohio State or Notre Dame, all of a sudden he goes to a 4-star without doing anything. So obviously, I like to see kids that are freshmen, and I'll give them a 5-star if I think they're that great of a player and you project them a little bit. And I've done that this year. I just saw one out in Imhotep for Philadelphia. He's only got a couple of small Temple and all that who know about him, but he's going to blow up. And I gave him 5 stars. He's a phenomenal athlete. I like to do it ahead of time, and I don't want to be charged and say, well, only because he's got offers is the reason why you're giving him. And like I said before, stars are meaningless. I've had running. Barry Sanders came into the booth and remembered me from his high school days in Wichita when I didn't give him a lot of stars. And the big one was Peyton Manning. Eli brought it up on the show. That's when I started the star system with the 5-star. I used to do 2 stars before that, but Peyton Manning I gave 5 stars to, but I gave Josh Booty 5, and he was number 1, and Peyton was 2, and they're both from Louisiana. So 10 years later, I'm walking into the camp with Buddy Tevens, who was now the head coach at Dartmouth, and Buddy was running the camp for Archie Manning. And in the cafeteria, only 2 people in it. It's Archie and Peyton. I go, hey, guys, how's it going? And Peyton goes, hey, how's your buddy Josh Booty doing? Now, Josh wound up going to the Florida Marlins as a number 1 draft choice and playing in the major leagues for a little bit and then going to play Europe and bat. But he never turned out to be as good as Peyton. But Peyton kept that grudge for 10 years. Now he's an all-pro with the Colts, and he's kept that grudge. So Eli was telling me that, and he goes, you think you have a bet? He's kept a ton of grudges with me all his life. And Eli's a lot younger than Peyton. So Peyton will hold a grudge against Eli. And I think that's what makes some of the great ones. And Mike Olsett, after I got divorced, my son went down for the school year in Florida. His mother was a school teacher in Tampa. And when he was like 10 years old, he's on the radio. He goes, Dad, Mike Olsett was bad-mouthing you on the radio with my old co-host, Gene Deckerhoff, who does Florida State and Tampa Bay Bucks. In the 90s, we did a national show, Gene and I. Anyway, he's going, Tom Lemming said I'd never be a tailback. I never this. And that I said that, but he was really a 1-back with Tampa Bay Bucks. He's 250-pound sledgehammer, and he was a 4-time All-Pro. And but in my defense, I gave him the Player of the Year honor in 1991 in the Chicago Sun-Times. He gets it. And again, and that's when I said, well, he's going to be a great player, but he's not going to be that's why Purdue got him. Notre Dame, Michigan, Ohio State turned him down. They didn't think he'd be a tailback, but Purdue knew how to use him as a sledgehammer type running back, and he wound up doing the same thing in the pros. But him, and there's been a few other guys like that Peyton Manning, Barry Sanders, and I felt bad with Barry Sanders because look at you. So I go see Francis Pay, who's the head coach of Northwestern at the time, having lunch with Francis. And I tell Francis, hey, Barry Sanders really still remembers that I didn't give him a lot of stars and rank. And he goes, you remember, he goes, I brought him in for an official visit with his older brother, Byron. We had one offer to give. I made the decision to give the scholarship to the bigger back, Byron Sanders, who wound up being all Big Ten. and he let Barry just go. So Barry goes back to Oklahoma, go back to Wichita with no offers. Signing day, the reason Oklahoma State now acts like, oh, we did a great job of evaluating. No, they didn't. They had Thurman Thomas as a freshman, the best running back in the country. No one back then, everyone stayed 4 years. No one wanted to follow Thurman Thomas. And that's the only reason. They needed some more guys in the backfield. So they took Barry Sanders so they could use him as training camp fodder, and that's about it. He turned out to be better than Thurman Thomas.
Wow. So, like, I watched the NFL draft, and sometimes, I mean, they can't even pick the players. Who's going to be great? Who is the best? Who's the best? I mean, I guess Saban's the best evaluator of talent.
Oh, yeah.
Who's the best? If Saban's the best, then who's number two?
Guys that worked for Saban, like Kirby Smart, all of them. Sarkisian was not a great recruiter at USC or Washington, but he was at Alabama, and he is at Texas now. I would say guy, Urban Meyer was a great, I did
Talk about Urban Meyer.
Yeah. Urban called me a couple months ago because he's doing Fox and the Big Ten Network. And Jerry DiNardo, who I brought in, I've known Jerry since he was a GA at Colorado. And when Jerry got fired at Indiana, I brought him in as my co-host. We did 8 hours live back in 2005. And then he did so well, we wanted to hire him. He went to ESPN for a year, and then he's been with the Big Ten Network ever since. So they called me up at 10 p.m., and I'm about an hour away from downtown Chicago. And Urban goes, come on down. We're all here at Italian restaurant down there. I said, Coach, I get there at 11 midnight. They're closing. I'm not going to come all the way down there. But I've known Urban since he was a GA, and he's just like Nick Saban. I think they 1 and 1A at the most, or maybe equal. And I did on my TV show a couple years ago a Mount Rushmore, and I had 6 guys on it over the 40-plus years. And it was Phil Fulmer, because he was at Tennessee, where there's no talent in Eastern Tennessee, or very little. And he still was able to always be a top 10 recruiter. And then there was Urban Meyer, Nick Saban, Mac Brown, who's a fantastic recruiter. And then Pete Carroll, obviously, was one of the great ones. Pete was a fantastic. And then Bobby Bowden. They were the best I've seen. And then right after that would have been Barry Switzer and John Robinson. But John Robinson, who's ever at USC, if they don't recruit well, they're not doing the job, because there's more talent in Southern California than any other place in the country. Not state-wise, but a concentrated area. And the young guys would have been Orgeron had he stayed, and James Franklin and Dabo Sweeney, younger than the other guys, and they're up and coming. And Marcus Freeman at Notre Dame, I think, and I think Coach Scott Blanda can attest to his recruiting ability, because he learned under Dabo.
Agree. And I think, you'll see, we had a lot of guys committed last week, so we'll keep on building. Can't say too much about it, but yeah.
I know. Yeah. I can talk, you can't talk. It's tough. I know you're not allowed to.
Yeah.
Bland, you got anything else you want to ask Tom, or get Tom to talk about?
With the staff, because the guys are really doing a good job, with our guys, and I think we'll see it on the field, and you'll see it down the road.
You got anything else you want to ask Tom or get him to talk about?
I think I'm good.
Tom, is there anything else we haven't talked about that you think needs to be documented? A story, a coach, Pete Carroll?
I've got a million stories.
Yeah,
I got a million stories, but
give me your top two.
We could do that. So I think one of the I mentioned a few of the stories when Mike Leach was always great. Because I filmed for 9 years in Tallahassee with Gene Deckeroff on Sports Channel, which is national show from 91 to 99. Had a lot of Bobby Bowden. Bobby Bowden, I don't think had his headset connected near the end. He looked like he was always trying to get in the huddle with the coordinators. But he was a great, phenomenal in-the-house type recruiter. And one of my first subscribers was the actor Burt Reynolds. And so Burt was sending me, I kept the check, and I kept a little cart thing from it. So this is back in the late 70s. Burt was living down in Florida. He played at Florida State, and he roomed with Lee Corso. But anyway, Burt would tell me stuff. And then I got in a kind of run-in with Florida State with this in-house recruiting coordinator who I thought was a little suspect. And then Gene Deckerhoff knew Burt because he was the voice of Florida State Seminoles. So I went down there, and Burt was coming up. And the first thing he says, "Hey, I hear you don't like Florida State." And he punched me in the arm. And I said, "No, Coach," I said, "I just didn't. Burt, I didn't like so and so and so." But he was like a real good guy, and I liked him a lot. And he sent a picture to my mother, who was a big fan of his, to the day she died. It was to Mrs. Lemming, love always, Burt Reynolds. She had it on top of her TV, autographed picture. And I always thought that was wonderful, a guy to do like that. And similar situation, Lloyd Carr wrote the foreword to my book. And he was head coach in Michigan at the time. Across from the hall was Bo Schembechler, former great head coach, and Alex Agassi, assistant, who had been coach at Northwestern. So I came in right around the beginning of Lloyd Carr's thing, and Bo comes in the room. I'm sitting in across from Lloyd talking, we're shooting the bull, and because we were going to go to lunch, and then Bo comes next to me. He goes, Tom Lemming. He goes, I always thought you hated Michigan. And I said, no, coach, I just didn't like you. And he punched me in the arm too. And after that, we became great friends. And Bo was a wonderful guy. And I didn't know it because early on, Lloyd Carr told me, Lloyd and Gary Muller had been fired from Illinois, and they both gone back at Michigan in '79. So Bo in a meeting goes, who's this guy in Chicago telling everybody we're bringing in 3 quarterbacks? And Lloyd goes, Coach, we are. And he goes, yeah, but we don't want people to know it. That's back in those days. And they go, well, it's Tom Lemming. And he goes, invite him to our banquet. They always had a banquet every year in this prestigious hotel downtown, real old one in Chicago. So I went down there, and there was always 10 tables of alumni, and the top 10 recruits would be there, one at each table. I'm sitting there, and I noticed that at each table, they had a raffle from beautiful gifts, Michigan big leather jackets and this and that. And all 10 kids won the raffle, even though there's 10 people at each table. So I realized each person at the table, the alumni, would write the kid's name up and put it in the box. So that's how all the kids. And then I remember Bo coming up and go, hey, you didn't see anything here. I mean, this is all past it, so I could say no. Yeah, I said, every other school was doing that anyway. But I thought there was back in those days. I was wide-eyed. It was right when I started the '78, '79 year, and Bo Schembechler talking to. He was one of the gods of college football. I thought the same of Joe Paterno until I got to know him, and didn't like him at all. Joe Paterno was not a good guy, and I believe he would have gone to jail had he lived, because in the trial, didn't the president and the AD said it was Paterno's idea to keep it all in-house. And I think they were sentenced. And that means Joe would have been sentenced too. Yeah. And I didn't like Sandusky. I didn't know he was a pedophile, but I didn't like him, or Franny Ganther and all the guys, Greg Ciano, all the guys on that staff. So after around 81, 82, we all stopped talking, because one year on a Pittsburgh radio show, I said Pitt had a better year than Penn State. And that was it. Paterno wanted to control everybody in the press, which he does. He did. State College. He had trouble with Pittsburgh and Philadelphia newspapers, but all the other towns, Harrisburg and York and all of them, he controlled those writers. If they said one bad thing, they'd be out of a job because they only covered one team. So anyway, as soon as I left ESPN, I went to CBS, and we did a big 1-hour show. We taped the whole thing, but it was at a combine in New Jersey. 70 colleges were there back. This is 2005. Colleges are still allowed to be there. And, and we had Charlie Weiss up on the stand. Urban Meyer came up, Greg Ciano from Rutgers. Every school was there. And then they had me mic'd up and walking around to interview other coaches, because they're all in like little circles of 5 or 6 guys. So I see a guy, Rocky Alt, that used to always be with Mike Gottfried at Pitt and Kansas and all that. And I go up and I start talking. We're filming it. Cameraman's behind me, and I'm going, Coach, how you doing? He goes, let me introduce you to all the other guys. And he goes on and on. And then finally, one of the guys was Jerry Sandusky. And I see him, and we see each other. And I just walk away, and I cut it. And I hear my producer going, who's now the executive producer of CBS, going, Tom, what happened? We just got started. Go, there's somebody here I don't like. And I said, I'll move on to another group. I didn't know he was a pedophile. I just didn't like him. And that seemed to be what happened with most of those Penn State guys. They didn't like him. And I think they all had to take their cue from Joe Paterno, and that was part of the problem.
Yes, sir. So I appreciate you coming on, Tom. I'm going to press end here, and we'll just chat for a little bit if you would. But I appreciate you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to say to your fans out there?
No, the magazine should be out around August 1st, the Prep Football Report, and 250 pages. And I'm writing it right now. I just got off on the road. And so I've been writing it as I go along and then updating it, because as Blanda knows, you can get a commitment, then 2 weeks later, the kid's going to switch to another school or switch high schools. I've seen some kids this year that have been at 4 different high schools, so it's awfully difficult to keep track of these guys.
No doubt. Thank you, Tom, so much for coming on. Blanda, thank you.
My pleasure, guys. Here.